The American Slovenian Education Foundation, ASEF, is an organization that enhances American and Slovenian education activities, uniting Slovenian scholars and educators globally. It has three core values: academic excellence, character formation, and dedicated service, permeated by special care for Slovenian heritage. In the ASEF podcast, we host ASEF professors to get to know their research, best practices from their field, their vision for the development of that field in Slovenia, and how they envision collaborating among Slovenians worldwide. Welcome to the third episode of the ASEF podcast. In our first episode, we explored the field of astrophysics, and in the second episode, we spoke about computer science and artificial intelligence. And today, we will be talking with three ASEF professors about cancer research. With us are Professor Tit Albreht, Associate Professor of Public Health at the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Ljubljana and a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Public Health Association. Professor Robert Jeraj, Professor of Medical Physics at the University of Wisconsin and University of Ljubljana, and Professor Mateja Jamnik, who is Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow at Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence, who also recently served as a Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the United Kingdom. Thank you all so much for joining us today. First, I would like to ask you if you can briefly introduce yourselves, tell us where you studied, for how long you've been in the field, and something about your current research. And please, Professor Jamnik, start.
Hi, my name is Mateja Jamnik, and I originally come from Slovenj Gradec in Slovenia, but I have lived for very long time in the UK. I'm a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And my work is related to using artificial intelligence methods to study human-like computation and applying it in healthcare and education. So in healthcare in particular, we're interested in investigating personalized cancer medicine. I will say a lot more about that later on. And thank you very much for inviting.
You're welcome. Please, Professor Jeraj, continue.
Sure, thanks. I'm Robert Jeraj. I'm a professor of medical physics at the University of Wisconsin, but also a professor of physics at the University of Ljubljana. So I've been balancing between the two worlds for the last 20 years. Having research groups both in medicine and in Ljubljana, doing research both in medicine in Ljubljana, or in Slovenia, better say. And main topic of our research is focused on cancer resistance, cancer heterogeneity, and particularly using quantitative imaging in order to predict responses, to predict outcomes, and then optimizing cancer therapy.
And lastly, Professor Albrecht.
Yes, hello. My name is Tit Albrecht. I'm originally from Ljubljana. I lived most of my life in here. I did my postgraduate studies in the Netherlands, still the old, almost forgotten Master of Science in Rotterdam, and later PhD in Amsterdam in health services and health systems research. So a bit different from the two colleagues here, an antipode and more oriented in public health, population health. My interest in cancer is in cancer epidemiology, cancer policy, and also how to improve all aspects of cancer care and cancer control. I was one of the co-authors of the European Guide for Quality National Cancer Control Programs. And I'm currently working on different activities in cancer control at the EU level. And professionally, research-wise, I'm also active in the European Public Health Association, where I was the co-organizer of the European Public Health Conference in Ljubljana in 2018 with about 2,000 attendees. So I like to keep myself busy as well as the two colleagues. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for introducing yourselves. And now let's dive right into our first topic, which is cancer research and healthcare policies. So, Professor Albrecht, as you mentioned, you are a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Public Health, specifically regarding cancer. How do cancer prevention policies differ at the EU level? Are there different regulations regarding chemical components and different awareness strategies across the countries? What can be done to further improve such prevention practices and policies in Slovenia and EU?
Well, yes, that's quite an interesting question. I would split it in two parts. One is the primary prevention, and one is the secondary prevention and early detection, as we usually do. Primary prevention, one part are lifestyle determinants, and one part are environmental factors. Years ago, when Slovenia was preparing for the first presidency to the Council of the European Union, we wanted to make actually environmental impact on the development of cancer a topic. Interestingly enough, the European Commission was not too happy about that because they said it's too complex to raise in a single presidency of 6 months. So instead, we addressed the cancer policy in a broader way. I will say that the difference between the EU and the national policies is visible on both sides, on the environmental factors and on lifestyle. On lifestyle, a lot has been done on tobacco control, not as much as in USA or Australia, but much more than in the previous decades. One topic where Europe is in the lead, unfortunately, globally, is the consumption of alcohol. And given that alcohol has a significantly important causal relationship to 12 different cancers, all of the intestinal tract, oral cavity, and even breast cancer, this topic is, of course, extremely important. Then, of course, we have the problems of obesity, inadequate nutrition, and physical activity. Environmental factors that are obviously very often mentioned by the population in the surveys, but policymakers are not really addressing it the same way as now we are seeing the global environmental challenges. So there is radon in our housing, radon in professional settings. Then we have asbestos, which was a problem for many, many, many decades for many people around the world. This has been banned, at least in most of the developed countries. So this was legally sorted out. But of course, there are other carcinogens that are still important. I think that only a concerted action can actually address chemical carcinogens overall, and only singled out efforts are not so successful. In the second line, I would mention the screening programs, which have been shown to be very successful, but they require commitment, good data management, and registries, and of course, money. So some countries have been very successful. Fortunately, Slovenia this time around is on the good side. We have good coverage by the 3 recommended screening programs. They're running very well, and they survived the challenge of COVID, which is also an important aspect. We have recently had an event coordinated by the European Cancer Organization where we demonstrated the fact that there has been actually no change in coverage by screening programs. One thing that I could give as a cue, as a punchline to my colleagues, is actually the part of prevention which is the trickiest so far is the early detection. And early detection requires good analytical work. And I think that this is something where an umbrella organization such as the European Union can be of great assistance.
Okay, and now moving on from the policy side to more research and development. So, Professor Jeraj, you are involved with oncological research, as you mentioned, both at the University of Wisconsin, at Carbon Cancer Center, and at the University of Ljubljana. What differences do you see in approaches to oncology between the US and Slovenia?
Yeah, thanks for an interesting question. And I think when we talk about oncology, and I'll mostly limiting to oncology research, I think it's important to understand different stages, and some of this very well outlined by Professor Albrecht just a little bit earlier. So cancer prevention and control, then screening, and then diagnosis, and then therapy. And I think if you look at overall, I think Slovenia is doing really well, pretty much on all the aspects, with some exceptions. I think if I look at cancer prevention control, I think the policies and the efforts are very comparable. If you look at the screening programs, I think I would say that probably Slovenia has, luckily, probably even better screening programs, especially penetration into the society, with almost full coverage. Say in breast screening, DORA program, something that we've been involved with as well. And then if you look at then diagnosis, that becomes a little starting to, I would say, lagging behind, especially in some of the newer diagnostic procedures. Some of the some that can be that are linked to some modern technologies are potentially lagging behind. For example, we are lacking in Slovenia some of the modern molecular imaging screening or diagnostic procedures that can more precisely. We do have some genomic testing diagnosis, but it's still kind of like catching up. If you go in a therapeutic stage of cancer, then if you look at the, say, drugs, access to drugs is pretty much covered very well. There's a big difference in Slovenia compared to the States, where universal healthcare enables everyone basically getting access to the most modern drugs. But it is that Slovenia is lagging behind some of the more advanced, technologically advanced or more expensive technologies, and some of this, which we'll touch about later, for example, like proton therapy for cancer, etc. But if anything that I see most drastically different in oncology research is that Slovenia just simply doesn't have appropriate infrastructure for conducting clinical research, clinical trials. So if I just compare what we have at the University of Wisconsin Carbon Cancer Center, which is so it has the catchment area, which is about a quarter of Slovenia. But like the clinical trial research enterprise is consistent of 100 plus support staff. If we compare this to, say, what they have at the Institute of Oncology, it's really something that's really lagging behind. So I think overall, mostly I would say that the main difference is the ability to conduct state-of-the-art clinical research. That means clinical trials with novel agents, with novel treatment technologies or diagnostics or any of this. And I think that's something where I think the some of the efforts and some of the resources need to really be supplemented to what is currently done, I think, at a national level in order to catch up. And I think, and we'll probably come as soon as we get to the next guest. Especially in the times of precision medicine, personalized medicine, where the data is a very important component of it. I think, collecting the data, organizing the data, having that ready for modern technologies of AI, artificial intelligence, that's something what I think Slovenia is also a little bit lagging behind in terms of organization.
And Professor Jamnik, you were a specialist advisor to the House of Lords Selected Committee on Artificial Intelligence, helping UK government in policy directions. So I'm sure you must have a very good overview over both the research side and the sort of policy making side. Part of your research efforts are invested towards the applying of the AI to advance personalized cancer medicine. We currently see that there is much investment into like a wearable technology that can monitor our activity in many aspects, such as our heart rate, the quality of sleep, etc. How do you envision such monitoring can change diagnostics in medicine, in particular in cancer diagnostics? And can you perhaps provide us with your view on how medicine can change if we combine such data with the one that is available to pharma companies and the healthcare system while employing the artificial intelligence on top of both of those?
Wow, that's lots of questions all at once. So thank you very much for them. I'm going to try to address them in three bits. So yes, I was involved with the select committee on AI in the House of Lords in the UK. So that's basically when the government in the UK appoints a select committee to do an investigation into a particular issue. And here they were particularly interested in what could be the impact of artificial intelligence on society. And based on the report that the select committee provides, then that influences what policies they put into place, etc., etc. So I don't really have an insight into how they they decide and do policy, but I do understand what factors influence their decision and what kind of information they get from these kinds of specialist committees. And it was extremely interesting because we were basically interviewing, like, I think probably about two to 300. There was a public call for anybody to express opinion about this, and this was any Joe Blogs on the street or the biggest companies in the world or the brightest academics in the world had all have written in. There were like thousands of pages of written material, and then we selected and called experts in very many areas of life that AI impacts. So, for example, there was things about data privacy. There were sessions about education. There were sessions about healthcare. There were sessions about military use of AI. There were sessions. I mean, it was literally a very, very broad way. It was sessions on international collaborations and leadership in AI in the world and trends and so on and so forth. So at the end, there's a comprehensive report that informs the government with their decisions as they make them going forward. So that was a very interesting part of work that I took part in. And why is the government appointing specialist committees like this that then appoints me as a scientific advisor to them? Well, because I mean, our world and the way we interact with it is currently changing dramatically. And I think that artificial intelligence is one of the conduits that is really, really changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact, and so on, in essentially every aspect of our life. So we could say that we are essentially at maybe the fourth AI revolution. And I think that because the impact is so huge on all aspects of life, people are interested. And the reason that there is such impact is because we have these AI new techniques. We have the machine learning techniques in particular. We have huge amount of data that you referred to when you were talking about wearables, that we are collecting all the time and producing all the time. And we have massive computing power that enables us to actually analyze that data. And so we can also revisit now because of the amount of data and the computing power, we can revisit all of these actually existing methods from the past that now we can deploy them in a new way. And so, for example, deep learning is not necessarily a new idea. It is just applied in a new way, and it is groundbreaking. I mean, it's a game changer for many areas of life. And yes, so we collect the data, and it is really very much changing. In particular, in my work, which is related to personalized cancer medicine, we are working with oncologists and clinicians and participating in their clinical trials where they are collecting all these different streams of data about patients. And we are trying to deploy these machine learning AI algorithms on that data in order to give us a better insight, to enable us to diagnose better in a more personalized way. So does the patient need first chemotherapy or an operation first? What would be better given their particular genetic makeup, their particular clinical science, and so on. So what we're doing is we are trying to help clinicians build a system, a clinical decision support system, where they can engage with these AI methods and use them to help them in their decision making. And we can go into more details later on.
Thank you all. And now we will move on to the second topic, which would be cancer and radiomics, which is the field where Professor Jeraj works. So I'm gonna start with asking you, Professor Jeraj, a question about what radiomics actually is. If you can introduce your research a bit and tell about radiomics for the general public, for all of us who are not as familiar with what that actually stands for. And maybe address how radiomics helps the advancement of cancer diagnostics.
Yes, radiomics is kind of like a new catchy word. And some people say it's a response from the imaging community that was frustrated because it didn't have any omics, like the same as genomics, metabolomics, etc. So like we need to have our own omics. So they just coined the word of radiomics, coming from radiology. In essence, it means that basically what we are doing is extracting multiple information from medical images. Traditionally, medical imaging is in the domain of radiology and nuclear medicine, where you would have a human person, physician, reading the scans and then interpreting the scans, most often using it for a diagnostic. So, and that information is typically, does somebody have a disease or doesn't have a disease? Now, it turns out that, not surprisingly, there is much more quantitative information in the images, especially if you do and you acquire images in the right way. And that's the general field of so-called quantitative imaging. So imaging in some way splits between the qualitative imaging, as I said, like what I mentioned before, like diagnostic radiology, where you use that and you mostly information, the output is disease, yes or no, thumbs up or thumbs down, as opposed to quantitative imaging, where you make sure that information that you get from images is quantitatively describable. Then you can look and follow with time, for example. So radiomics is often used to predict the response to certain therapy, see whether there is certain changes that are done in the therapy, or maybe some predictive of somebody even getting cancer, for example, or other diseases. It is sometimes misused, as many other things, as are all good catchy words, because similarly to genomics, you can get a lot of features extracted, a lot of genes. And when you start correlating to the outcomes, you might get a lot of false hopes, false positives. So use of radiomics, particularly in combination with other omics, is quite powerful, but it requires very careful consideration and application. So in some way, radiomics approach is almost the opposite from AI approach. In AI approach, you get like artificial neural networks to find the correlations between the signal, let's say in the image, while in this case, you describe your signal in the predefined number of certain features and you try to correlate that. So in some way, they're quite complementary. They can inform, if you do AI right, they can inform you which features might be predictive, or something that you can then help guiding AI as well. So radiomics is actually a really good counterpart to AI, something that we'll talk more about that later. Is that clear enough for non-imaging experts?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your lovely explanation. And now, Professor Albrecht, we previously spoke about health policies in Slovenia and EU, as well as around the world. How do you think that radiomics and preventative medicine tech advancements should change current health policies in Slovenia and other countries? Do you think that there is some ongoing discussion about this on the global level?
I think there are many, many challenges in this particular field. Of course, this is not a field which I would be very familiar with, but I listened with great interest Professor Tang to a lecture by Professor Tang from Amsterdam last year, 2 years ago, when she was explaining the use actually of AI in diagnostic and therapeutic radiology for cancer. And I think that the potential and the capacity given by innovative, let's say, explorative techniques supersede anything that we could possibly physically imagine as having in our memories or in our minds. So, to my understanding, both in terms of diagnostics and in terms of therapeutics, this is of course the future, because the subjectivities that we are facing with when we are trying to deduct from our own pragmatic experience instead of running, let's say, having the database of knowledge behind us is an extremely big difference. I think that in Slovenia, well, it's the Institute Josef Stefan and also the Institute of Oncology who do a lot of research also in that field. And I think that international collaboration for a small country as ours is extremely important. And that's why I'm happy that Robert is still linked so strongly to the home country, because this means that there is a great potential of transfer of knowledge and exchange of experiences and so on. In many ways, of course, Slovenia can sometimes be seen as a good laboratory because it doesn't have the challenges of a country like Germany or UK or France or Italy with dozens of millions of people. So, and I think that the main thing I'm hopeful for in Slovenia is the allocation of efficient funding for research and connecting as much as possible to the international funding. Of course, in the first line for us, it's the EU funding, which for cancer is going to be substantial. Also in this field that we are discussing. Also, obviously, global collaborations, which are facilitated also by the Horizon Europe program.
Okay, thank you. And now circling back to Professor Jamnik. So among the many research works regarding AI and cancer, we found some interesting scientific papers that you investigate the importance of integrating a variety of cancer patient data types to produce more accurate diagnostics. Could you provide us with quick insights into this line of research and maybe highlight some of the main findings and maybe challenges that lie ahead?
Yes, I want to, in fact, go back to what Robert was saying, that radiomics and radiology and AI, they go actually hand in hand. We very much love radiologists giving us features from their images so that we can then use them in our algorithms in making predictions about what we see in the images. And that's precisely the sort of thing that we are actually doing and developing. But in particular, what the idea that of the project, that this particular project that I'm working on, is that, you know, when the patient comes through the door to the doctor, there is a certain pathway that they go through. And so the first thing they do is they talk with the doctor, and so the doctor collects clinical data about them. And then the next thing they might do is they might do some imaging. And so they will get some imaging data, and maybe they'll take some bloods and get some molecular data and so on. And then they will decide, do we need to do a biopsy? So they might even get some digital pathology type images. And then finally, before they make any decisions, or perhaps whilst they've already made some decisions, they will collect the genomic sequencing data about the patient. So this kind of streams of data are coming in for every patient. And so we are working with our colleagues, the clinicians, in the clinical trial, where they're looking in particular at breast cancer, and in particular at the very difficult triple negative cohort, because it's so difficult to predict what's the best course of treatment for them, and the outcomes usually are not very good. So, but the idea of the project is, at the moment, what people do, or what the clinicians do, is they deploy they use their knowledge and if they deploy algorithms, but they deploy algorithms that are specific to a particular type of data that I've just mentioned. But wouldn't it be great if you could take all of those different types of data into consideration at the same time when you're doing the analysis, rather than trying to find the connections between what one algorithm found on one type of data and another algorithm found on another type of data? And that's precisely the idea of the project that we are working on, which is we're trying to create methods, AI methods, that can integrate all these different modalities of data for a particular patient, and then help making decisions and predictions. For example, at the moment, the task we are looking at is the PATH-CR. So it's one of the typical outcomes that the clinicians would be very interested in with cancer patients, and so that they know what so that they can make better decisions about what the next course of treatment should be, and so on. So we are building these, we're integrating so much more a holistic view and much more personalized view then, because this is all the data that is particular for this particular patient that is sitting in front of me. And we're building systems so that the clinicians can actually make those decisions and then can engage with those algorithms. They can actually use them. But not only that, because these methods we're not building them because we're trying to replace clinicians. We are really building them so that clinicians can use them to help them in their decisions, and can also feed back the domain knowledge that the clinicians who are specialists have. So, for example, they might decide and tell the system that they want to put more importance to a particular feature about the patient, and then the model will recalculate and try to make a prediction based on that particular piece of knowledge that has been added now to the entire model. And this is a big part of what we're doing. We're trying to enable also clinicians not only to use it, but also to interact and feed back to the system the information and the knowledge that they possess. So I think that this is really, really very exciting. But of course, there are lots and lots of challenges and obstacles. First of all, it's not obvious how these methods should be working with these kind of so many different modalities of data. There, for example, in genomic data, you have 20,000 features, which is like a huge, huge feature space, but you have only perhaps 100 or 200 patients. So you had a very small data set, but very highly dimensional. So that's notoriously difficult, especially for these data-hungry, modern, deep learning approaches. So that's one of the bigger challenges that we are looking at the moment. So high dimensionality, small data regime, so small number of samples.
Thank you so much. And yes, as you mentioned, there is plenty of challenges. One of them is also privacy. At the beginning of our conversation, we spoke about health policies in Slovenia, EU, as well as other countries, of course. And medical data is really sensitive to privacy issues. And so is the monitoring data from different variables, as we previously spoke a little bit about. So what do you think are the main privacy concerns and possible solutions? Is it possible to seek synergies between private companies, a healthcare system, and pharma companies, whilst respecting citizens' privacy? Whoever can start.
I can maybe start, because in the EU there was a big and long struggle to, I would say, normalize the directive for the data protection, which is now infamous under the abbreviation GDPR. And originally that directive was drafted in such a way that a lot of what we have been talking about would be made impossible, because you would have to have individual consents drawn up at the beginning of any kind of research from patients. And as Mateja has indicated, the interests and focuses change, and you cannot know at the beginning of some sort of research what additional research questions you might pose if you don't leave yourself enough space for that. then you will have to restart and you reshape the team and all sorts of things. And in the end, it's going to be more burdensome for the patient. The old truth is that patients are the least skeptical about data sharing. What I would say, given that both colleagues are very experienced also in exploration and data management and so on, I think that the techniques, as I was told by people who are better in that field than myself, today you don't have to invade on anyone's privacy when you are looking at anonymized aggregate data for scientific purposes. It just has to be made clear what your intentions are. Of course, publicly financed or research made in public interest is easier to defend. So people have a little bit more confidence. I will not say now, in view of COVID, this is sometimes has been shaken. But overall, there is more confidence. With respect to pharma and commercial, we have to remember that also research projects often involve private sector. It's not that it is something unexplored. Just we have to delimit what the areas of interest are and how you may or may not commercialize what you have found out during sort of a research endeavor. So I think when this is clear, then there is no real limit to the involvement of the pharma and the private sector. Thank you.
I might just add a little bit. I understand it, but I find it also a little bit ridiculous. You take the smartphone and you get a new app. No one has any problems just clicking yes. I consent to everything. When it comes to the healthcare data, the regulations and provisions are exorbitant, understandably, but like they're just way too much. And there is a big damage that's being done because we are not able to collect the data. We're not able to use the data. I think we're all paying the price of, similarly to, somebody was planning to or thinking of putting a bomb into a shoe, and now the whole world has to take the shoes off. So 99.9999999% of the people are paying price for somebody who might do something at one point. And I think in a healthcare, this is like a very measurable damage that's being done by not having access to the data. Particularly this data intensive. And, as Mateja was saying, we are left with a too few data that some of the methods could be much more efficient if we had access to the data. Is really kind of like damaging the whole progress and slowing the progress. And I'm not saying that we should not make everything to protect the data, but I think it's unproportionally in a way in the healthcare compared to what we do, for example, data that's not being protected.
Since you are working in US and in Slovenia, is there any difference when you're trying to use medical data for your research in US versus in Slovenia?
Yes, it is. The GDPR is known to be the most restrictive. And I'll give you just an example. In the US, imaging data, anonymized imaging data, is not even considered human subject data. So you can freely share it. As opposed to in the GDPR, that you cannot do it, even if it's anonymized. It's under the restrictions under GDPR restrictions. And I think that makes it, again, one could argue, if somebody can reconstruct from like CT scan, like somebody's face and then recognize. But really, how many people are really want to do this, and why would they do it? And even if they did it, what would they do with that information? So I think certain of the level of the GDPR is maybe too restrictive and causes, again, like additional hurdles. Now, that doesn't mean that in the US, you freely share the imaging data. Not at all. It's essentially almost the same thing. It's just that the threshold for the protection is being, and I think it's getting better as people are getting a little bit more comfortable with it. But there are some additional hurdles on the EU side through the GDPR, which is at the moment the most restrictive data protection.
I have to say, I have a difference of opinion. I really think that the only way that we will protect ourselves is through regulation. And in fact, I think that in terms of data we generated, we should be in control of that data. And I'm absolutely in agreement with you that the vast majority of patients will be very happy to sign away and allow that data to be used for research purposes. And I don't think that there will be any problems with that. And there will be only one tick on the form, and you'll have to anonymize the data and you'll be able to use it. But, the more we see what lack of regulation is doing now in terms of the data that's being collected by the social media and so on and so forth, right? No regulation, complete Texas, and nobody, the power is in the hands of 4 companies in the world because they have the data. And I think that is just unacceptable. And I think that regulation is the only answer, especially in sensitive data like healthcare data. And, yes, you have to go through a few hurdles, and you have to ask the person who produced the data, who was the generator of the data, whether we can use that data in order to do research. But that's about it, right? And then it's on you to anonymize it so that it's not unrecognizable, but that's the same everywhere anyway. So, yeah, I think that in terms of, and especially, like you have Google now, Google Healthcare, right? Do you want them to go unregulated? No, I don't think so. So I really think that those safety measures are absolutely in order and should be in place. And I'm really not talking about where the data resides or who is the owner of the data. I'm talking about who has the control over the data. And I think it should be the person who produces, who is the generator of it. But we shall see, because there's a difference of appetite for regulation. So in Europe, there's a lot more of it, a bit less in the UK, in fact, quite a bit less in the UK, and almost very little in the States. So, whereas, I don't know, in China, it's a completely different ball game altogether about that. So, interesting questions to address.
Yeah, just a little. I think what you said is absolutely right. The regulations have to be, but they have to be kind of like proportional to the benefit or expected benefit. And I think that's part of it. You said, like, the social media, all the data, total chaos, and then the kind of like, how to say, not over-regulated, but over-cautious. And I think it's not regulation. It's like over-cautious and over-emphasizing potential breach of confidentiality for applications where it definitely would speed up development of medical solutions. And I think that's where it has to be found in media. I think the well-regulated healthcare data became a victim of non-regulated social media data because it was already regulated before. So, and it's a subject. So it's definitely a huge imbalance.
Yes, and I agree. You mentioned China. Well, we know the story of facial recognition, but that's true of central London as well. On the other hand, because you have cameras everywhere, especially in protection of safety and preventing petty crime. But it's interesting how there is this lack of, resistance to that, because you record all sorts of movement that could compromise specific individuals because they were in a certain spot at a certain time. I heard another interesting reaction from colleagues in Belgium on DNA databases, which was because of the techniques that allow very small samples to be processed and successfully determine the identity of the person. They said that if there is too much access of different institutional entities to the database where you were maybe voluntarily providing your DNA sample, you could be linked to criminal offenses because you happen to hold a railing in an environment where a crime occurred or something like that. So, of course, there is the more we go micro or nano, the more these macro consequences are appearing. But I agree, it's not easy to strike a balance. Of course, for example, Slovenia is very sensitive to this because of the smallness of the nation and the fact that so many of us know each other and the fact that you just snap a tiny piece of information can detect the identity of a person. But I can tell you a practical example from a research I've participated in. It was about mobility of doctors. And the shading of the cells in Slovenia occurs when the number of units is less than 5. So then it is between 1 and 4, any value. In Austria, this occurs exactly at the 4 times value. So any cell that has the value less than 20 becomes shaded. But that means anything between 1 and 19, which makes some data provided that way almost unusable, because you can only guess the values. So this can lead to hampering certain aspects of research, but it also needs to be distinguished how critical the identity may be. And I agree with Robert that, for example, an anonymized, even CT scan or MRI, well, as you said, you can link it to an actual person eventually, but why make such an effort? And why would this person be targeted? Anyway, I think that can be sorted out in a different way.
If no one else has to add anything, I will change the trajectory of conversation a little bit more towards Slovenia and the future in Slovenia. So as I mentioned, or Professor Jeraj mentioned previously in the conversation, there is an ongoing discussion regarding the development of proton therapy center in Slovenia to enhance cancer treatment. Such a center would provide not only enhanced cancer treatment capabilities, but also provide many research opportunities. One of the expected partners for such a therapy center is the Medical Physics Research Group. And Professor Jeraj, could you provide us with some insights regarding the therapy center and the importance of building such a center in Slovenia?
Okay. Thanks for the question. That basically links to what I said earlier, that in certain parts in Slovenia is lacking some of the modern technologies. And obviously, some of the modern technologies come with a little bit heavy or higher cost and price. But I think what also it's sometimes not understood, they also come with a tremendous opportunity for developing and for enhancing the research infrastructure, etc. So to go a little bit into the proton therapy, just for cancer, for people to understand. So proton therapy is a modality that actually how radiation therapy for cancer, one of the main pillars of cancer treatment, has started. But then majority of current today's therapy is done by photons. So and photons have a little bit different dosimetric properties. So when you radiate somebody, like a cancer or tumor in the body, those photons transverse and they go through the body, while the protons have a limited range, so they can stop at the edge of the tumor. So the main advantage of the proton therapies is to reduce the dose that healthy tissue gets, not the tumor, at the same tumor dose. Now, that doesn't come without technical challenges. That's why this has lagged, the development has lagged behind the photon. It comes also with a cost. But there are some of the advantages are very or undisputable, and particularly important, for example, for a pediatric population, where we do worry about long-term radiation effects. We heard from Professor Albrecht earlier about like radon as one of those that are an important element that might lead to more cancer in the society. And in this population, definitely protons would be of advantage. Now, Slovenia doesn't have such a center. There's been discussion for some time. There are centers around Slovenia, in Italy, in Austria, Czech Republic, but really nothing kind of like southeast from Slovenia. So Slovenia is actually left at two options. One is just to, build or not to do, and then the patients would go out, travel to foreign countries, or get treatment at home. Now, if you want to do treatment at home, it's fine. We have, again, like two options. One is just to get a, turnkey solution and just do the clinical practice of proton therapy. The other one is to combine it with radiation or with the research opportunities. Now, at the moment where we are now is that we have a very strong support from the clinical community as well as from the Ministry for Health. On the other hand, the other ministry for research and education is actually much more cautious. So even though the investment would be relatively minimal at this point, basically just provide some additional resources for the research, it's kind of like the disconnect between the ministries are kind of like a little bit hampering the integral solution of the center. So I just hope that the government will come together both on the clinical and the research side and enable development of such center. Now, again, the protons is just one of those high-end technologies that I think Slovenia can lead, especially with the integration into European research. We are, interestingly, we initiate and are leading something which is called the Raptor Consortium, which is a real-time adaptive particle therapy for protons. The only country that doesn't have protons, and it's part of that consortium together with everybody else in the EU that has like large centers like in Switzerland or Austria or elsewhere. So clearly we have a know-how, we have people. It's only part of the will to do. But all these investments need to be very carefully considered, because you don't want to just invest into something that's not well supported through everything else. The integration of such proton center into the existing infrastructure at the Institute of Oncology needs to be sorted out. The before mentioned the clinical trial infrastructure, sufficient support that, for example, every patient that's enrolled in such a center would become part of the clinical trial, and data could be then used for future developments, needs to be sorted out. So there is a lot of work. So I think for all these projects, like in general, Slovenia should kind of like reflect and make and take it as an opportunity, not only looking at just how much things will cost, but then smartly pick some of the projects, and those that are picked. And we'll talk about this, for example, later about the AI center, really develop and invest into it. Slovenia cannot afford to be everywhere, but I think those that are smartly picked technologies, I think, can really, really move forward and put Slovenia on the map. That is done in some of the examples. So, and I think the Proton Center could be, but only if it's done right, and if it's done comprehensively, both from the clinical as well as research angle.
Maybe just a comment. I fully agree. I will start by one of the common saying in Slovenia, which is the small type thinking, which would say, why the hell do we need that? We can get on with less, and we still survive somehow. We have a practical problem, I have to say. I talked to the colleagues from the Institute of Oncology. What decision makers often don't understand is that indications change. When I was a medical student, CT scans were something already a little bit advanced. Then MRIs came, which was a totally new opening for possibilities, especially neuroradiology. And similarly, in therapy, when you have an expensive technique, at first indications are limited because it's so expensive. Actually, it is also driving the price up because you have few patients. And then you broaden it. What has happened is that Slovenia decided years ago not to have a proton therapy center because we have centers nearby. We will send patients there. It's not a problem. There's availability. But now waiting lists have been created both in Vienna and in Italy. And for many patients, especially children, this is stressful by itself. They are away for so long and it's not friendly. And then we need to start thinking also out of the box of our small nation. And we could provide a center that would cover Western Balkans or a broader region more to the east and southeast, as Robert has indicated. It's not so risky as some people might think, but of course, there needs to be some effort invested. But there's no doubt that there is a lot of cooperation going sub-regionally that would probably easily enable this kind of patient flow as well. I remember when, before AI, data mining was one of the buzzwords, and also in the Institute of Josef Stefan, and there was a very keen group that wanted to influence our colleagues in the institute, and we made some workshops, and it was just not possible. The deterministic thinking of some of my colleagues was making it impossible. They couldn't start thinking in different terms, and it's a pity because you open up so many new possibilities if you stop the I think, Mateja, you indicated that very clearly. Also, these fragmented approaches that you look at one thing and then you look at another thing, and there is no interaction view, comprehensive view, and the body is so complex anyway. So looking at something in isolation is inadequate by definition.
But from technical point of view, that previously was not possible to do in a different way because methods were specific. So, for example, for images, you have CNNs, and for another data, you will have a different model that works best. And so, but now we're finding technical solutions for that to be possible to do it in an integrated way. So I think that's what's really exciting, I think.
And the idea, I mean, what the Dutch professor was showing, that for example, when an X-ray would be analyzed by such a system, it would look back into the database of hundreds of thousands of other X-rays, which no person in this world can memorize ever, and offer variations. But of course, it's not the magic potion. It's just an important aid for people to use.
Yeah, definitely. And at the moment, one of the visions is also that we will have to look into the federated learning approach, because the vision is that you have a lot of regional hospitals that don't necessarily have a large number of patients and a large amount of data, and they should be able to access for the same type of patient. So, for example, in our case, triple negative breast cancer patient, to the model that was generated at Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, where we've seen the largest cohort of patients and have the largest amount of data and have the most precise models that are possible to date, let's say, so that they can just access this from a regional hospital or add their data from their patients to the computation of the model when the model is being trained from their hospital, even though that data set does not exist in any one particular site, but it's distributed. So yeah, that's the future directions that we're looking at, how to democratize this entire process.
Yeah, I think another challenges that we that it's kind of like just a human, like the expertise that sits in different institutions, for example, is not really crossed. And like Slovenia's got that challenge that you have Institute of Oncology, University Medical Center on one hand, but then most of the, let's say, AI is done at the Institute of Josef Stefan Institute and University. So, and those bridges are not necessarily well. I mean, they're established, but it's still it's quite a bit of a gap that's hard to bridge. So I think integrating and having that.
So what would help? How would you enable that better integration in Slovenia, for example?
So, and not want to say what we have, but that's when we created our medical physics research group. I purposely created with the 4 institutions. So University, Josef Stefan Institute, Institute of Oncology, and University Medical Center. So we have people sitting on all the institutions, and that makes a big difference. So when we talk, we get like people from, and you match. You have like a physician and a physicist talking at the same time. And I think that's really the only way. But it's a lot of effort that goes in order to do that, and it has to be willingness. And it takes a while. But this is something I don't know, Tit, if you know, but like we're now doing the next generation of DORA, so applying AI and radiomics, essentially both, on like DORA. So we basically created an infrastructure at Institute of Oncology that we mirror at the university, where DORA data, imaging data, is automatically flying into that. We can then do the AI on top of that, or learning of that for better prediction. And it's really it's phenomenal that it works. And when we have meetings, we have basically meetings among all the institutions, and I think that's the only way that you can pull together. But yeah, people usually come in a different stream, and it's hard to cross. So I think it's very important that we do it early on. So like in training. So one of the things that we did, that's maybe interesting for you, Mateja, that we might talk maybe in the future. So this year, we actually organized a first national competition on advanced analytics of medical data in Slovenia. We called it DRIS. So RIS, and it was basically we used it for so we gave students data for prediction of COVID. So we gave them like the CT data with COVID to predict the severity of COVID. And that's what we'll do next year. So next year we're planning to focus on neuroimaging, prediction of Alzheimer's, etc. But what we found was, like, I think the second place was basically won by a team of two brothers. One is a medical student, one is the computer science student. But and then there were teams that were like, so that's what we try to grow. And I think that's when you start early, then people get used to this cross-discipline collaborations, and actually they love it and they enjoy it. But the barriers when you come later, it's much harder than when you when you start early. So that's some of the attempts we try to do too.
So for us, for example, we are working very closely with the oncologist, and it's the Addenbrooke's in Cambridge is a university hospital, which means that a lot of the clinicians, they are also employed by the university as researchers. So they split their time between the clinical practice and doing the research. And when they're doing research with across the board. So they will be doing it with us, with mathematicians, with physicists, and so on. And we sit together. And I know that there are so many obstacles because we speak a different language. We have different things in mind. And it took us a long time to sort of understand how to communicate, to be able to, because we are vital to each other. We need to understand the clinicians' knowledge and the domain, and they need to understand what are the sort of things that we require in order to be able to produce stuff for them, right? So we've managed this now very successfully because everybody was willing. And so it's an integration of researchers, clinicians, and in fact we're talking with companies that might be, and finding ways of collaborating where they can provide services that will benefit the project and the research and the advancement of science, and yet will be also interesting to them as commercial companies.
Yes, but that's something what you said in the beginning is like that's in the same institution. While in Slovenia you have multiple institutions that are like making it harder to do that. It's also in European model of having most of the research done at the institutes as opposed to even universities. So you have another partner that comes in. And then I think the third very important component is that physicians don't have time for research. They don't have protected time. There is like the model of, clinician researchers just doesn't exist in Slovenia. So like here, like clinician researcher would have like 1 to 2 days clinics, and the rest would be open for research. In Slovenia, it's like 5 days clinics, and then if you're lucky, you do something in the evening or in the afternoon. And that just doesn't. It's not a kind of say like sustainable model on a larger
But
scale.
I have to say, it's not just that it's one institution, because, for example, the one of the partners in this project is also the institute, which is Cancer Research UK, which is one of the biggest institutes for cancer research, right? And so they are integrated also with the university. They have their building on campus next to the hospital, and the funding comes jointly from them, from the external funder, and the people who are doing work are researchers from the institute, are clinicians from the hospitals. and the hospital and our researchers like us that are computer scientists from the university and other departments. So we all work together, we all come together. It's a whole consortium of people that has completely very structured and regular and very structured plan of work. So we have to work with each other, otherwise because we all believe that we need each other, otherwise we can't advance in the directions that we set ourselves.
Since we've been talking about collaboration between researchers and institutes and all of that, and this already is a huge challenge, what about collaborating between researchers and institutes and policymakers?
I think that I would go back just a second to what Robert was explaining. I actually had a study visit at the Institut Curie, which is one of the biggest treating and research hospitals for cancer in France. And interestingly enough, only the basic researchers have full research time allocated, but clinical researchers have a very similar position as in Slovenia. So that means that they are basically struggling. They are doing a lot of research in their spare time, especially studying literature searches and so on. And then maybe when it's really related to treatment, they can use the clinical time. So this is one of the problems for sure. I think that in the medical profession, you have to realize that I'm sure both Mateja and Robert know that very well by now. One of the problems is the inherent individualistic nature of the profession. So teamwork is not so easy to achieve. Even multidisciplinary teams, which today should be a norm in treating cancer, because nobody has the full knowledge of addressing let's call it a standard patient. This took a long time, and we wrote papers on that and so on. But I think it really starts from education. So you educate students jointly on joint topics, on joint research. Maybe you start with researchers who are a specific crowd, but you will infect the others gradually as well. As far as the policy goes, I think I will also quote Robert because he mentioned this reserve with the Ministry of Research. I think that the research arena is often very limited to the narrow perspective of research. So whenever it sounds like something of health policy, and I think that this proton therapy center is one of these topics, they start thinking, well, this is the matter for the Ministry of Health exclusively. We do not want to get involved, although the intellectual backbone of such a concept has to be multidisciplinary, multi-professional, and of course also research-based. And finally, I will mention another cancer, which is now a strong candidate for a screening and has been pushed a lot. Mateja and Robert, I'm sure you know, is lung cancer. And lung cancer has similar challenges, as you mentioned, Robert, with DORA. It's imaging. Imaging is the primary step in screening. So if this is done high quality level, it will work well. But of course, if you will have a lot of misdiagnosis, whether over diagnosis or underdiagnosis or any kind of uncertainty that both professionals and patients will perceive, it's going to be challenged very soon. And I've been talking to people who are doing the research in Europe, the Nelson study. And of course, the radiologists involved are competent, more than competent. They have very big turnout of patients, but they do not understand that the challenges are exactly the same as they used to be years ago with breast cancer. And so I think that this just confirms that you cannot even launch such an exercise without multidisciplinarity, and then also indicating the potential to the policymakers, which it can have or may have in real terms.
Do you, Professor Jamnik or Professor Jeraj, have any input into collaboration between policy makers or ministries with research. I think that is especially important in Slovenia because this is my personal view, but I think that in Slovenia we don't give enough money to research institutes to have perhaps enough valuable research so we could make one step forward. What is your view on this?
So I don't know what the situation is like in Slovenia because I haven't lived there for 30 years almost now, but I think policy should always be informed by science. That doesn't mean that you get a one unique and right answer, because the nature of science is that the people won't agree because there are different interpretations possible of the same outcomes of experiments, etc., etc. So, however, there is, scientists come up with solutions and have the knowledge of the problem and bring evidence to support claims and their theories and so on. And I think policymakers really should be making their political decisions based on knowing the scientific facts. Yes, of course, there are other factors that come into the political decision after the scientific facts, but you start from the knowledge and from the science, and you take that into as your starting point to inform where to go next. And I'm not sure how much of that actually happens in Slovenia, especially with this current government.
Just a little bit of experience, and I completely agree with what has been said. I'm just reflecting on me sitting on one of the FDA committees for molecular drug advisory committee, and the level of how I kind of like saw how the FDA works from the informed by science into their decision has been I was just like blown away. And part of that has been because they're doing a really thorough research, but then basically they get experts from all over to weigh in, and that provides the advisory to FDA that pretty much is followed most of the time. I think one of the challenges that Slovenia has, as opposed to say FDA or other institution, is that Slovenia is just too small. So there is no way you can get like such a diverse panel of experts even to inform. So I think this would be great to hear from Tit. I think maybe the policy is really best done at the EU level, where you have like much larger pool, but of course, like then translating it into national specifics. But of course, like we've seen, through COVID, what that's not perfect, and that leads to a lot of mess. And and then when it gets the decisions that are more complex than the just science informed, that also leads to deterioration of the trust of the public into the science, and I think that becomes really really dangerous and damaging. And also feeling from the scientists that like their voice is not respected. It's not, and also I think from the public that thinks that science is not to be listened to, and I think that's really damaging. And then basically the society pays the price for that. That's what we see right now. So I think Tit is definitely by far the expert to maybe weigh in on that. But
no, I think you're right. I mean, obviously the numbers of experts in especially niche fields are too small. I mean, there are simple problems already. Rare cancers, for example, you cannot have policy on individual rare cancers in Slovenia. What I would say is that definitely the multinational, supranational levels can bring the power. The problem I see with politicians is that they go on 2 or 3 visits to other countries, and then they become impressed with tidbits of different practices. And they say, well, I saw this in Sweden and it looks great. Yes, but it's not only that thing. And that thing is a part of a process that has been established even in that country through years. do you want to establish the whole sequence? And I think, Robert, you referred to it with the example of the proton center. It's not only building or buying the machinery and having somebody to maintain it, it's also the whole know-how behind it and the people who are going to work with the results and the patients and really develop this further. So this is one thing that the supranational level can, let's say, help steer politicians somehow, I would say. Of course, what I observe in COVID, I see two problems. One problem is that normally scientists and researchers go back to the literature and they quote probabilities, or they quote some answers, potential answers to questions. But here we were in the middle of something that is ongoing. So it is useless. And of course, the media are now doing something that they can do also because not only because of social media, but because we can look at the history of anything and say, well, you said in March 2020 something about this. Yes, but we didn't know much. It's embarrassing to say, but we didn't know enough. But it's the first time. And the second thing, I think that the big experiment of throwing a lot of numbers at the general public has not worked very well. I will put it just a simple example. I always loved math, but if I remember my high school class, I think that not more than 1/3 of us actually was interested in advanced mathematics, and everybody else was just waiting for it to pass. So you cannot expect these people to understand logarithmic curves, exponential curves, and so on, or even interpret what it really means. And now everything is thrown to the public. And I think that the politicians thought that this was making things more transparent, but it actually resulted in a lot of layman's interpretation of numbers and data. And I see that some of the things that people should understand by now, of course, depend on their level of literacy. I mean, intellectual literacy, not, of course, formal literacy. And they are unable to cope with that. It's too much. So anyway, I agree that you have to have evidence and research-based informed policy. And of course, the strength that Slovenia has is at the same time as we are small, we can also provide a good experimental environment for many initiatives that can fit into such a small setting. But in most complex questions, we need international collaboration, I would say. And I do hope that this develops further, both through the EU and other initiatives, because it could potentially provide a lot of very efficient input and support to development in Slovenia.
So we are slowly reaching the end of this episode, and I would like to pose some final questions. And I would like to ask you, what are your hopes for future of the cancer research, and what kind of predictions can you make about cancer research and cures for the next 10 to 20 years? Professor Jeraj, please start.
Yes. When talking about the prediction of the future, I really like to go back to the former director of NIH, National Institute of Health, Elias Zerkoni, who was once justifying the budget for the NIH in front of the US Congress, and basically had a vision of so-called 4 Ps of P as letter P of medicine. And just to summarize his quote, I'm happy to get the actual quote, was that the vision of the medicine of the future is to be fully predictive, so predicting in whom the disease will occur, with the personalized approach to treatment, will be preemptive, so that will try to prevent as much as the cancers or other diseases will occur. But also, importantly, the last P stands from participation from all the stakeholders, including the public. So, and I think I like that because it goes from prevention, where we try to minimize the burden of the disease or delay, to a much more personalized approach. So the patients are not just like an average patient, but like individualized, customized approach. I think something that Mateja talked before earlier, where there are a lot of hopes, and also potential for AI when we combine the data, when we are able to customize the therapies, and then something that Tit was talking about, the really participation, public health. I think we've seen how important is emphasis on public health. That I'm amazed during the last pandemic, when you look to reflect back into our curriculum in schools, no one talked about public health. And I think there is no awareness of importance of public health. But I think that's something that hopefully we learned through the pandemic. That's very important, that public participates in public health. Public has to inform about public health and also understand what are the consequences. Obligations of everyone to everyone, not just unto yourself. And I hope in a couple of years, not only the technology will help bringing the diseases better under control with less suffering, but also I think the people perception and mentality will change and go in hand with the technology as it develops. So,
Robert, there's very little to add to what you've said, because you touched upon all of our areas, right? It's exactly what all of us were talking about. Yes, my hopes for the next 10, 20 years are that we will have this personalized medicine, and that the AI technology will enable us to make this a reality that is at the fingertips of every single clinician, where we have democratization of capabilities through the technology, through the federated machine learning, for example, etc., in terms of sharing models, sharing data, and accessing these predictors and these tools across. So that's what my vision and hope for the future from the AI point of view is.
Yeah, I would add exactly to what Mateja has now stressed. In the past, cancer was presented as sort of one common disease or one block. Now, with genomics and with a lot of more advanced studies of etiology of cancer, of course, we learned that even within one entity, Mateja mentioned many times today the triple negative breast cancer. Breast cancer is not one disease. There are several diseases within which require, unfortunately, completely different approaches. This is where, of course, the new analytical and explorative techniques come in. And personalized medicine, one comment on that. There was a period when people, especially decision makers, were very, very afraid of personalized medicine because there was a mantra that this will push up costs tremendously. But on the contrary, there is a lot of evidence now that when you use focused therapies suited to the particular cancer that the patient has, you will actually reduce the need for blind treatments, which were the tentative treatments that were in use before, that put a lot of stress on the patient. And of course, the disappointments, the delusions, disillusionment that followed was terrible. And now we are, like Mateja said, we are very close to really tailoring the treatment to the patient. And this will, of course, open enormous possibilities of success in most patients. And not to forget, cancer used to be a very binary outcome disease. So you either survived or you died. You often died quickly or rather quickly. And today, thanks to science, we have patients who survive. Even with metastasis, they survive years and even more than a decade, a dozen years, which means that it's not going to be condemnation anymore for patients, but it's actually the beginning of a process like any chronic disease, which is also one of the hopes that didn't exist before the modern advances. I'm quite optimistic about it.
I would like to thank you all for such a great conversation. And maybe just as one final question, just before we close off, are there any resources such as any books, any articles, or maybe podcasts that you would recommend to our audience that would be further interested in the topic of cancer research?
Maybe I'll just say that I think, speaking of personalized approach, I would just encourage anyone who's interested to reach to any of us, and I think we can probably direct them to what they really would like to have. There is a lot of general books. There is a lot of things in, just Google it on the topics we talked about. But if anyone is interested into learning more, to get more information from things we talked about, I would just encourage you to send an email to us. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Robert. So, give us a buzz and we can see what you're interested in, and we can direct you, or in our experience, to further literature or further resources. So, but yeah, the internet is full of, from the technical point of view, from the technological point of view, it's full of repositories for data, if that's what you're interested in. It's full of repositories for commentary. It's full of scientific papers and so on. So send us a buzz and we can talk more.
Yes, I fully agree. Also, the resources that are available on research, it depends on which part of research on cancer. There is the International Agency for Research on Cancer in Lyon. In Europe, there is a lot of research going on at the level of the European Union and beyond. Cancer is one of the priority topics of research in this research program. So we'll be happy also to provide resources. So feel free to contact me.
Thank you all for joining us in this podcast. To our audience, we hope you enjoyed this podcast episode, and we will be glad to hear your feedback. You can send us an email to podcast@asef.net. Please follow ASEF on social media to learn more about our professors, fellows, and the many activities hosted by ASEF. We hope to see you for our next episode, where we will further discuss RNA science and its applications.